Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
But today we welcomed Professor Tom McLeish, who's Director of the Polymer Interdisciplinary Research Centre up at Leeds University. Tom started his life, as it were, research life here in Cambridge in the Cavendish, and then took up his chair in Leeds, I think it was 1993, and has since that time been really building up a very large collaborative group involving many research scientists and linked very much with industry as well. And he's also won several awards for his work on molecular rheology. If you don't know what that is, I don't actually, and I'm hoping we might find out as well. So, but we're delighted that he's come to speak to us about a very broad topic actually, and I think he's very well experienced to talk to us on this, values and science research. What is science for? So thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you very much indeed. Values in science, with a bit of theology thrown in. Why? Because when I was asked by our so Leeds University, well, by the way, I can tell you why this term's gone so quick. It's because it's only 8 weeks long. 8 weeks is not a long time. Anyway, Leeds University celebrated it's a very young university, its centenary a couple of years ago. And Professor Simon Robinson, now Professor Leeds, was our chaplain at that point, decided it would be a good idea to bring an academic festival of writing around the topic of values in higher education, produced this marvellously unread book, but thought at one point it would be a good idea to ask kind of a scientist at the coalface, right, who was doing science regularly, and as explained, running a research group, getting experimentalists and theoreticians together, talking with industry, making sure the fundamental science connected, all that sort of stuff, but to reflect on the ethical questions that arise today in that context and how that person found answers to them. And I thought that was a fresh idea for two ways. One is we tend to mentally leap from questions of values and ethics in science to some of the big topics that are post-it noted to the wall at the moment, like the Genome Project, like whether we should start another nuclear power program, and so forth. Rather than, and I'm sort of rather more interested in the day-to-day ethical issues that can either build or erode our scientific community Monday to Friday. So I want to think about that a little bit. The other reason I thought it was imaginative is because many contemporary ethical discussions around science don't really know where they start from. And obviously we have a previous history, you need, if you want to define an ethics, it seems to me, I stand in the tradition that says you have to have a teleology. You have to know what you're about. So that was what my subtitle is about. What is science for? Because until we realise what science is for, we're not going to be able to define an ethical framework for it. Interestingly, if you wanted to ask the UK government what science was for, in spite of the fact that they fund people like me, quite well actually, to be honest, you'll hear complaints the otherwise, but no one could have told you before the White Paper of 1993, interestingly. And in the White Paper of 1993, it was announced that UK science funding was to support wealth creation and, secondly, to increase the quality of life. Wealth creation, and these were enshrined, these two mission statements, or two teleologies, in the mission statements of each of the research councils, the Engineering Research Council, the Biological and Biotechnology Research Council, and so forth. The only research council that escaped was, I think, the Particle Physics and Astronomy Research Council. But you know, they have it now. Yeah? Now, why? I don't want to ask questions about that. I think it's clear politically where those statements come from. I want to ask, why are you uneasy about them? I'm assuming you are. Is anyone not uneasy about them? Why am I uneasy about them? Why? Why are we concerned about the predicament? Let's go back to one of the big post-it subjects. The predicament of a world faced with the enormous possibilities of the consequences of the Human Genome Project, but with a very flawed relationship with the science and the community of scientists from which it comes. or questions like global warming. Why are we concerned at the face of a public community who needs to be engaged, but doesn't seem to have the tools of engagement, who look to science for answers, right? I mean, science, you know, sometimes I like the Disneyland icon of science and technology for our modern world. If you've ever been to Disneyland in Los Angeles or Paris, for that matter, because it's squeakily clean. There's all there's never any rubbish about. There's never any. No one ever seems to be supplying the big machines and rides with fuel or oil. Now, the reason for that is that underneath Disneyland is a category, a maze of service tunnels, right, through which technicians and suppliers of cafes are scurrying. You do not know this, right? Nice and nice. Which means, of course, that everyone is free to enjoy the pseudo-paradise. Not my cup of tea, but anyway, you know, of the Disneyland rides above. Nice icon, I think, for science and technology. We like our cars, we like our air travel, we like our hi-fis, we like our high-tech products, but take a Radio 4 discussion a few years ago on the culture of sort of what makes or builds a culture of society. This nearly caused me to have a big car accident on the A1. She said Radio 4 can be dangerous to you. So they've reached the last of a series of 6 studio discussions among the wise and good and intellectual on culture in our times. And I was tuning into the last 10 minutes of the program. The chairman turned to the panel, said, "You know, it's a funny thing. We've done art and we've done dance and theatre and film and we've done politics. We haven't really done science in this survey of culture. Do you think we should have looked at science?" And one of the participants in the panel immediately replied, "Oh no." I said, "Oh no, no, we wouldn't want to have thought about anything so anorexic." as that. At which point I nearly collided into the lorry in front of me and blew a gasket. But you see, there's the Disneyland for you. Very happy to survive in a high-tech technological world, but very unhappy to recognise science as anything that might respond to the human and to the deep. Now, my thesis is that to build a teleology of science, what is science for, we need to recognise that science is not modern. I don't believe for a moment that science is a post-Enlightenment phenomenon. I believe it's very human. I believe it's the core of what makes human beings human. It's one of the things that set us apart and runs very deep and very, very old. Science, of course, as John Hedley Brooke will tell you next term, I'm sure will remind you, he's fond and wise to do, is neologism. It's also a very westernized neologism. I mean, the La Science, Wissenschaft, La Scienza, the other European languages have quite different connotations of the Anglo-Saxon, rather circumferenced science. But the word scientist is a neologism. It's only been around 150 years or so. A much better word for what we do, I've found, particularly in talking about science to communities who perhaps are a little put off by it or have been in the past, is to use the old words of natural philosophy. Let's use the Greek, rather than pull on the Latinate knowledge claim of the word science, skio, I know. Let's resonate instead with the more ancient Greek tradition of wisdom, philosophia, love of wisdom, natural philosophy, love of wisdom about natural things. Try it next time you're talking to the South Barsley Men's Group or whatever you do about your subject. As I've done, and say, rather than think about science, think about love of wisdom of natural things. Does that help? Sometimes I get little smiles about that. What do we do if we work in a theological tradition like the Christian tradition, which is my own? And here I'm going to take that for granted, because when I go, this is not apologetics, this is going to be theology. You see, within a personal story that lives within a community and a tradition like that, one views the science, your business, the business of this wonderful centre, the science and theology debate, of course, rather differently. So I wonder if I might excuse those who might think otherwise, but just to allow us the indulgence of dropping the apologia for a moment and picking up the Old and New Testaments and see what that narrative history might say about science. Now, I don't mean let's look up science in the concordance, of course, right? It's not going to work because, but let's think about what science is for. We've already mentioned it. We've asked for answers, but we know, those of us within the scientific research community, that the key creative move within any science research program is to ask the right questions. This is why, and I'm sure the scientists here will recognise, this is why we have to retrain all our research students at Leeds who emerge from, well not Leeds because we give them lots of projects and open-ended work, as I'm sure you do in their undergraduate career, but very often, right up to undergraduate level, the hoops these young people are being asked to jump through have all to do with answers. That may be the reason that some very bright young people, particularly the ones I talk to in sixth forms who haven't chosen to do science, say the reason is they didn't perceive a role for imagination or creativity in sciences at A-level. Silent scream, rises within me when I hear that, because we all know, those of you who experience the scientific process, there's nothing so creative, demanding on creativity as imagination, as us confronting the physical world in all its otherness. But we have to train them not to think about answers, because there aren't any answers in the back of the textbook. We have to think of educating ourselves to ask the right questions. So it's the open-endedness and questioning and searching nature of science in relation to the physical world around us I want to pursue. So let's not look up science in the concordance. Let's search around for discourse on relational discourse on the relationship of humankind with the physical world. Now, when you do that, of course, you find a biblical scene amazingly rich, wonderfully rich. Of course, you find the creation stories. Now, here's a little aside. Perhaps if I throw out a few asides, they may be picked up in question time. One other aspect of the current public face of our science-religion debate, if I can call it that I will abhor, is the close orbit around Genesis 1, right? Which I think is utterly misplaced, a huge red herring, and to be honest, rather dull. Much of it, sorry, I'm not treading on any corns, I'm sure I am, and rather irrelevant, you see, and certainly not fundamental. So I would put, of course, Genesis is important for theology of science, but it's not at the top of my list. I would have put it around number 10. Right? There are other far, far more important theological statements in the Old and New Testament that might guide a teleology and ethics of science. I hope to persuade you of them. For a start, there are creation stories shot through. And of course, our eyes get attracted, of course, by the more rococo, more developed, more extended creation stories. You know, Genesis is probably relatively late in terms of an Old Testament creation story. There's much older literature. The older core material tends to be shorter, more succinct. This is true of every biblical, this is kind of standard tool in criticism, form criticism, right? Often it's the little summaries that get unnoticed in some of the older literature that one ought to be paying more attention to than the big trumpeting verses, although it's the big trumpeting thing I'll come to later. So there are creation stories all through Psalms. Psalm 95, Psalm 104. I'm not sure we have time for actually quote. Let me pick up one and let me go straight to Proverbs 8. Okay. Now, in the wisdom literature, particularly, you'll find a tremendous amount about our relation to the physical world, and every time that's mentioned, there is at least an implied, if not explicit, creation story. Here's my favourite for what it's worth. Proverbs 8, I'm sure you're well aware for it, the Song of Wisdom. But it's a creation story. Listen, the Lord brought me, wisdom is speaking, forth as the first of his works. Before his deeds of old, I was appointed from eternity, from the beginning, before the world began. When there were no oceans, I was given birth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills, I was given birth. Before he made the earth or its fields or any of the dust of the world, I was there when and this is important, set the heavens in place, marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, established the clouds above, and fixed securely the foundations of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundary, so the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was the craftsman at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world, and delighting in mankind. Better translation of the Hebrew there is playing. You know, is a little child, a picture of wisdom as the little child, playing, cavorting in the sandpit of early creation. But that theme of setting the foundations of the earth, setting the heavens above, and giving the sea and the land their boundaries is very old and comes up over and over and over again. Jeremiah is very fond of creation stories. Repeats over and over again that creation story, and in fact once very cleverly, and do the exegesis of Jeremiah 5 at some point, in one of the prophecies of the consequences for creation of Israel's disobedience, and you will find that Jeremiah assumes that his audience know the code of the Hebrew creation story. He knows that they know that you set the foundations of the earth, you give the sea its place, you set the boundary lines, and you set the heavens in place, because he runs the film backwards. Oh, I'll show you. It's well worth looking at. While we're here. I looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty. Jeremiah 4, I beg your pardon. And at the heavens, and their light was gone. I looked at the mountains, and they were quaking. At the hills, they were swaying. I looked, there were no people. Every bird in the sky had flown away. I looked, and the fruitful land was a desert. Its towns lay in ruins before the Lord, his fierce anger. You see, he's run the film backwards. And it's a horrifying view of a sort of anti-creation. So, just one thing to say here. There is a richness of creation stories in the Old Testament, and in fact in the New. John 1 is a creation story. Romans 8 contains a creation story we'll get to in a minute. And so let's widen our debate. If we are going to have a debate about biblical creation, what it says, let's at least talk about all of them, right, in one breath, and see how many different visual images and pictures were given to understand our relationship with the physical world. But above all those, I could give you a little list of them, there is one that stands out, like the Himalayas above the clouds, that ought to have attracted our attention long, long ago. It did for some. But for me, reading as a scientist, took my breath away the first time I ploughed through the whole thing. And that is, of course, the book of Job. The book of Job is, within the wisdom literature, for me, the most important Old Testament text for thinking about the ethics of science. And you could probably survive on it alone. Now, I really mean it. It's quite extraordinary. Why? Okay, now you know that we don't quite have time to go through all the 42 chapters of Job. It's a wonderful book. But by the way, not many people know this, but one of them happens to be a former science correspondent of The Guardian. And when I learnt that fact, I was very pleased, actually, as you might imagine. So, who'd taken a sabbatical and written an entire master's thesis on the book of Job, from the point of view of a science journalist. This is Tim Ranford, science journalist interested in deeper things. So, Job. By the way, here's a little exercise for you. When you're going through on Old Testament exegesis on physical world and its relationship with humankind, you will always find that the discussion is in the context of pain, theodicy. Okay, dear. Always, just think, Proverbs. That book is shot through with the pain of not having wisdom, of what happens when you don't have wisdom. Genesis, let's go to Genesis. Creation story 1, creation story 2, fall. The creation forms the backdrop for the pain of the thorns and the childbirth, right? So, not surprising, therefore, and the prophecy we met in Jeremiah, creation stories. Why creation stories? Because of the pain and anguish of broken relationships that the prophet is talking about in terms of community. No surprise then that when we get to the book of Job, the whole debate is about pain and suffering. It's the great theodicy, right? And Job's argument with God, right from the beginning, is cosmic. in Job 10, the first accusations that are hurled at the silent voice of the Almighty is that the cosmos is in chaos. There's the world. There's no control of the whirlwind. There's no control of the storm. There's no control of the earthquake or the pest. It's out of control. Why this injustice? And you know the story. There's Job suffering. His riches, his family have been taken away. His so-called advisors come and taunt him and say it must be his fault. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. Legal banter. When will the Lord speak? You have to plough through a lot. There's a wonderful chapter, Job 28, which has often critically been thought to be an interpolation, but as I say, I think that betrays a lack of understanding of the interweaving of justice and cosmos throughout the whole book. Chapter 28 has a picture of what it means to be human. Don't you remember it? The picture is the miner. It's an underground gold or jewel miner dangling and swaying on his rope under the mountains, and only humans' eyes see underneath the surface of the earth, see the structure of the veins of silver and the jewels. A beautiful passage. But it speaks of what it means to be human. That's the argument here, because the debate is about the dehumanizing experience that Job has had, and about the chaos of the cosmos. This is tensioned with a belief, deep in the writer's heart, that there's something about humans that give them the ability, the astonishing ability, to look at the substructure of creation. Yeah. Might that be another definition of science? We know what science is for. The reason science is wonderful is that science is about peering beneath the superficies of. Okay, science goes beyond appearances and rebuilds with our minds the structure of the world. I mean, what did John and Jeffrey Cantor published a study book on the Gifford Lectures a few years ago? They called it Reconstructing Nature. Yeah? We reconstruct nature in our minds by going underneath. The Lord eventually speaks, as you'll know, from Job chapter 38, and you deserve it when you get there, with a creation story. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together? And all the angels shouted for joy. Beautiful resonance of Proverbs, that lovely, lovely song. And then 3 chapters of questions. And this is why scientists, when I'd say you might want to read Job, are fascinated. Because, as you'll know, the passage has sections. It's a poem, it's a huge poem. Each verse is a question, and each question teasingly directs Job to a different aspect of the physical creation. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? How have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Where is the way to the abode of light, and where does darkness reside? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Does the rain have a father? Astronomy, can you bind the beautiful Pleiades? Can you loose the cords of Orion? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's laws over the earth? Extraordinary suggestion there that the heavens as well might go by some law. It's a very legal document. So we could go on. There goes to zoology. So in fact, anachronistically to be sure, but it's quite possible to label each section of Job 38, 39, 40 with the subtitles geology, astronomy, meteorology, zoology, and so on and so forth. Now that is how anachronistic is that? Because we already know the great creative step is here, the way the creative asking of questions, and in a way this sets the agenda for what later becomes our science, and stretches the boundaries as well, right into the unfamiliar, the behemoth, the Leviathan, who I made just as I made you. There is more in the creation of God than our current petty imagining. So we could go, but right at the context of pain, we could go on. I said all biblical science talk is painful. Somehow the focal point of that in the New Testament seems to be Paul's extraordinary discourse in Romans chapter 8, which begins, "There is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus," famous big therefore, and finishes with the extraordinary statement of there being nothing of reconciliation, that there's nothing that will separate us, neither suffering nor pain nor storm nor illness will separate us from the love of God. It's a great reconciliation, but the middle section of Romans 8, which is the bridge from the one to the t'other, is about all creation groaning. All of creation will be in pain until the children of God are revealed. And by revealed, it's clear that Paul means in their proper position, under God and over or within the physical creation. Very physical passage, with this explicit image of childbirth. So it's a very brief talk. This is a very brief tour. And clearly, there's a whole series of lectures in this, taking the Bible, creation passages in this way, and I'm going to really concertina it down. But I hope you can see that there's a lot of fun mileage there. One comment to finish. There is only one passage I can find, one that has to do with this relational understanding of science, us and our physical and the physical world, human beings' physical world, which does not mention pain. Only one. And it's there because it explicitly doesn't mention pain, and that's Revelation chapter 21. Okay? There will be no more pain. But it's also about the physical world. Think how physical and substructural John's vision of the new creation is. All that chrysolite and beryl and stone is, right? All those strata, where have we met those before? In Job 28, right? There's something rather technological, of course, as has been said many times before, about the new city. So, look at a biblical. However, okay, that's the biblical bit. But if that's not your thing, then others have said very much the same thing. Another thing that nearly would have maybe crashed the car if I'd heard it on Radio 4 is this statement from George Steiner. Now Steiner is, as some of you will know, a character who fascinates me, a very great polymath, a great literary critic of our times, the holder of 4 European chairs. One of them here, I think. There's a visiting professorship at Churchill up the road, George Steiner, I think so, who in his extraordinary book, little book, about language and meaning, written into postmodernism, we'll get into ethics in a minute, Real Presences, writes, only art can go some way towards making accessible, towards waking into some measure of communicability, the sheer inhuman otherness of matter. I'll say it once more. Only art can go some way towards making accessible, towards waking into some measure of communicability, the sheer inhuman otherness of matter. Wait a minute. Making communicable, reconciling us with the sheer inhuman otherness of matter is what I thought science was all about. So, Mr. Steiner, science is art, but there is the need. There's the recognition that matter is entirely other and needs reconciling with. More prosaically, if you need another example, take Bill Bryson's introduction to his wonderful survey of science, a brief history of nearly everything, where he experiences this, writes about it very cogently in an aeroplane. Guy with no science background at all looks outside at some clouds, wonders why they have the shapes they do, and he records this, has absolutely no idea. And this leads him to a series of thoughts in which he realizes he has no idea about anything physical and how the world ticks at all. And this is the experience, the sort of cathartic experience he had, which sets him off to discovering science in, shall we say, late middle age. Of course, being Bill Bryson, he doesn't have to read any textbooks. He just brings up the 50 top scientists in the world, and they tell him about it. So some of us can get away with that. But if we have, as I've been pushing, suggesting let's quote Paul again, 2 Corinthians 5, a ministry of reconciliation view of science. So if science is part of that part of the church's ministry of reconciliation that deals with our broken relationship with the physical world. Okay, that's what I hope I've persuaded you of, right? Then let's start on the ethics, right? Let's see what ethical, or what value structure, before we even get to ethics, what value structure might arise from such a view. Okay, and I want very briefly to suggest 6 consequences of those. And no, I don't have a slide, so listen, right? But I have got a quote coming up. 6 points, and we'll just have to open this up afterwards. The first is that in that view, the natural timescales of a science project or program will be long, and the process will be deep, because deep wounds don't heal quickly. Deep wounds take a long time, and if that's what we're doing, if in science we're healing deep wounds, we don't expect immediate returns. Secondly, all this relational stuff belongs in a context of community, and we'd expect a scientific and healthy scientific community to be in debate with itself, not just about the objects of science, but about its process and about its future. We'll ask ourselves in a minute whether these are actually being realized or not. Thirdly, science is naturally multidisciplinary. Why? Because I'm suggesting rather boldly that science is a deeply theologically defined activity, and all theologically defined communities are naturally heterogeneous, highly heterogeneous. It's about living together when things are tough and we're different. Okay? So retreating into our silos is not an option for a healthy scientific value base. Fourthly, the functional process of science will be engaged with not only by those who are highly trained and labelled with that expertise. If science is a deeply human process to do with each of our need for healing with the physical world, then in some degree we all need it. Back to Steiner on art. I mean, no one would deny that there's an artistic side to all of us. Many would deny that there's a scientific side to all of us. But I firmly believe it's been stamped out for those that don't believe it's there. Fifthly, the goals of a science program should not primarily be linked to economic return. You see, that's why, now we know why we're uneasy when they are. That doesn't mean to say that there should be no economic return. There is an economy, there is a fruitfulness within which the scientific process participates, but it's not its primary teleology, which is that of reconciliation. And sixthly, this is as far as I've got, maybe more, I thought of 6, and this is rather a surprise, the celebration of the extraordinary human ability to go beneath the surface of the world and reconstruct it doesn't seem to know any boundaries. What this says is that I don't see any predefined boundaries as to what we may or may not do or talk about doing within science and technology. And that view I don't see informing debates on genetic engineering or climate change or anything very much at the moment. But I think it might do. Now, are these six attributes, long time scales, long and deep research programs, sustained communities, natural multidisciplinarity, egalitarian, inclusive science, non-economic goals, and a celebration of no boundaries, are they actually reflected in current praxis and talk about science and science ethics today? Well, in part, but only in part. Steiner, again, in another extraordinary view, comparing the arts and sciences, this time in his lecture to the Edinburgh Festival a few years ago, celebrates science as seen from his position as a cultural humanist, sees the science, quotes, in its noonday. You know, he's been a grumpy old man with respect to the arts for some while, as you probably know. He talks of the arts as being a secondary and tertiary city. You know, commentaries on commentaries on commentaries on Hamlet. You know, he dreams of a primary city where the only way you can critique a poem is to write another poem, not to write a book about a poem or a book about a book about a poem. And so Steiner turns to the sciences and says, look at the sciences. They're in their noonday. What do you say? There will be, this week by week, there will be new theorems. Theorems will be solved, crucial experiments performed, discoveries made next week and all the week after. You know, and so he means to contrast a sort of a sullen secondary arts and humanities world with a bright new noonday in the sciences. But we know within the sciences, we know, don't we? Do you know what is the average readership of an average scientific paper, apart from the referees? Do you want to guess? About 10, about 100, about 20? It's about 0.6. Okay. Now, what does that say about piling thesis on thesis on thesis? Rowan Williams, currently Archbishop, isn't he? Has a chapter in this book, on faith in the university, has a lovely icon for the scientists today, which sums up beautifully. In fact, I won't try and paraphrase him, I'll just read you what he says. The relatively brief periods of residential study means that there is not much time to succeed, to make an impression, create a persona. And the more you succeed, the more desperate the competition. You may even end up as a university teacher or administrator, devoting what feels like most of your working hours to explaining what you're doing and listing your scanty achievements for the benefit of the government. I've got to go to the Treasury on January just to talk to the Minister about why the funding for the polymer IRC thing in the 90s was a great idea and list the achievements. I'm happy to do it, but why jump through all these hoops? And I know it's a blind bit of interest in what it's actually about. With something, here's beautiful. With something of the same feeling Scheherazade must have had in relating the 1001 Nights. If you stop, you get decapitated. It's true. It's true. So Scheherazade, I am Scheherazade. Not so pretty, but that's what it feels like. That's in complete contravention of what ethical deductions number 1, 2, 3, and 4, right, of my last list. We were rather shocked. It differs within the scientific disciplines itself. Some of us, you'll know, have taken our polymer physics into biology. That's fascinating. I'm trying to live by what I preach. I'm not preaching too much. But multidisciplinarity means crossing the bridges at least between the sciences. It is extraordinary how heterogeneous the sciences are. It's not just that biology studies things that move and squiggle about, and physics does particles and fluids and things. No. The questions are different. The programs are different. What constitutes an answer is different. It's really amazing. And in fact, it would be wonderful to have a seminar here and study some of those questions within a theological context. But we were rather shocked when our biologist colleagues, who really are under intense pressure, more than we talk about the next program, the next question, they talk about the next paper. It's the next publication, because if you aren't focused on the next publication, the guys in Cambridge are going to, the guys in Leeds are going to get there first. It's terrifying. The packs behind you, the Sultan. We don't need the Sultan. We are our own Sultan. I think it's 45 to stop. Anything I want to say? I could say the consequence of public engagement. We have to do something about the long story, the long strand of. Let me just go through this a little bit. I had one quote for you from Keats. This from Keats, right? But this resonates with this journalist called John Appleyard. A few years ago wrote of science as the dehumanizing influence in our society today. Philosophy will clip an angel's wing, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air, and gnome's mind, unweave a rainbow. We need to do something to re-enchant the public mind about what it's like being a little child asking why a rainbow has those colours. got to bring that back rather than stamp it out. One thing we can do is to remind people of the old theological context for the naturalness of science. And sometimes you need to go to the church fathers. This is extraordinary. This is Gregory of Nyssa's on the soul of the resurrection. This is Gregory at his big, and brother was Basil the Great, at their sister Macrina's deathbed, arguing about the existence of mind. They call it the existence of soul. And Macrina, concerned at her younger brother's pain over her last gasps, some pain again, decides they should have a debate about science. This is late 4th century stuff, right in the heart of the Church Fathers literature, and it says this, right? Now he's having a game, so he game with his brother, her brother, so that he's not upset. And her argument for the existence of independent mind is, in a nutshell, that the mind can do science. Listen to this. It's by an abuse of language that the jar is said to be empty. For when it's empty of any liquid, it's nonetheless, even in this state, full in the eyes of experience. And proof of this is that the jar, when put into a pool of water, is not immediately filled, but first floats on the surface, because the air it contains helps to buoy up its rounded sides, till at last the hand of the drawer of water forces it down to the bottom, and when there, it takes in water by its neck, during which process it is shown not to have been empty, even before the water came, for there is a spectacle of a sort of combat going on in the neck between the two elements, the water being forced by its weight into the interior, therefore streaming in, the imprisoned air, on the other hand, being straitened for room by the gush of the water along the neck, and so rushing in the contrary direction. Thus the water is checked by the strong current of air and gurgles and bubbles against it. Pure poetry, pure theology, and pure science. Did you know it? That's exactly what science is about. It's about going beyond the superficial gurgleness of matter and understanding that what this is saying is that this bottle is not a vacuum. It's containing a substance otherwise imperceptible called air, but whose physical properties we can reconstruct the gurgling that we see. Now, science hasn't changed. It's experiment and theory and bring the two together. And it's at the heart of reconciling pain in the Church Fathers. So this is what I mean about rekindling the natural therapeutic use of the scientific, deeply human reconciliatory urge which is in all of us. I think this is very exciting. If there's art therapy, why isn't there a thing called science therapy? I think there might be. I think we could explore that. To do that, we'll need to go back to Macrina's bedside, but we will also need to go back to our universities and think again about what our science is for, and to our MPs as well. Just finish with the words of Rowan Williams once more, again his own discussion of faith in the university. Faith is a commitment to the belief that our life is more than a struggle between a creative ego, individual or collective, and a lot of raw material. It trusts that there is a possible reconciliation or atonement between human cells and their world. See, there's Rowan Williams again, with Steiner, identifying the ministry of reconciliation as something to do with the whole university interdisciplinary quest. My suggestion is that a love of wisdom to do with natural things would be a good travelling companion to bring with us on such a journey. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. I'm sure that stimulated some questions on a very broad brush, so anyone want to kick off? So, actually, I think someone's got a microphone as well, so I think I'll just ask the first question. I'm interested in your point 6, which was that basically science has no boundaries, if I remember rightly.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously you're going through that very quickly. Now, to me, that would have a very positive spin and a rather worrying spin. And the positive spin is, you know, we can explore everything, the universe is there for us to explore and understand to the greatest extent possible. But it could be interpreted as being, you know, we can change, I mean, you mentioned genetic engineering and so on. So could you just unwrap that a little bit, what you were, because I think it needs a little bit of amplification.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be a little controversial. Yes, I guess all I was really saying that it is not obvious. Okay, it is not obvious to me that we should not genetically engineer ourselves. That's what it means. It's not obvious that we should not do that. Interestingly, why? Okay, let me unfold a little bit more theologically. When questions like this arise, the tabloid headlines read "Playing God." Okay, and there we are again. And another great icon, John Turvey, hasn't he? He's written a book in Frankenstein's Footsteps, and has very helpfully shown how Mary Shelley's horrific vision has become a sort of currency for the understanding of the terror of science out of control, or science and technology, particularly when tampering with the human being. So I understand where the fear comes from, but arguably, those whom God calls sons and daughters, those who he lifts higher than the angels, those who he calls to recreate and participate in his ministry of reconciliation, are in some sense being called to play at God. It's interesting how you can turn, I think theology can turn that critique around and say, well, fine, you're being asked to play at God. So that is to some extent precisely what we're being asked to do, but that's why it's so risky. The biblical story is a story of risk, of people who have the power to play at gods, playing at being gods for their own purposes, for their own cause. So I absolutely hear what you're saying. There's a huge danger, but the risk is something we have to think through. What I'm saying is we have to go through, not around these questions. And so what I think we should do is not stop. And the awful thing is, if we just stop and say, out of court, as what's happened in the United States. You see, when it comes to stem cell research in the US, the government said stop, none, but it's not universally realised that the US government only has control over public funds. There is no legislation on what might be done in the US with private funds at all. Okay? And that is precisely the danger of what happens when you just say stop, we're not going to even talk and debate the questions. Because then the research is no longer publicly owned and becomes, goes dangerously out of control and starts serving other purposes. So keep it public and keep it in debate and keep it theologically informed, but don't edit that. But don't run away from asking difficult questions. Okay, thank you very much.
Maybe you can explain what's the meaning, religions and science. Because I'm from China, I'm a professor, study finance and sustainable development. In China, religious is fairly different to science, but so it is not relative to your topic.
No.
Maybe, if possible, you can explain.
Well, it's a good question. And in fact, I should have said, and not just in China, because I think many people would agree that that one difficulty, one load hanging on all debates, particularly public debates of religion and science, is that the participants clearly fail to understand what religion is or what science is. In most cases, both. So there can be the argument can be a projected argument against people's prejudices to what science or religion has or might be, rather than an argument about the substances. I think behind your question is probably a view of religion which isn't my own, but is often articulated, that it is a sort of timeless, changeless set of doctrines and practices, like Buddhist practice, whatever. You have to do and pray and sacrifice to this and this idol of these days of the week and these festivals, and that's what you do, and it's just a praxis and a set of stories that at that level really seems to have nothing to do with science, which should be and must be an open-ended, questioning exploration of the world and our understanding of it. My own understanding of religion, which I think is about, it's a word I don't like to use actually. One thing that persuaded me of Christianity was that actually I always thought Christianity as sort of anti-religion rather than, but I can't go into that now, but I was thinking it's rather anti-religious for very good reasons. But what one might call true religion, the way I've been using that word is rather parallel to science, an open-ended exploration of meaning and purpose and relationship between humankind and the person who created and engages with the world. So in many ways, I find a method or praxis or experience in religion and science rather parallel, because both are open-ended, both involve communities, both involve stories, both involve ideas that change with time and events that happen. I probably shouldn't say anymore, but that might happen. And I enjoyed talking about this with some people in China actually on my visit there last year.
Why the theology in the science is necessary? Why? Can you explain again? Yeah.
Right. Didn't Einstein say something about this? But I can never remember which way around it was. Faith without science is lame, and science without faith is blind. Was it the way around? Yes, it was that way around. So you don't actually need to be a believer, a religious believer of any kind, to do good science. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that to understand what science is for and to decide what we should use it for, and as in all things, I mean, how one should make individual decisions and local decisions as well, that science is a deeply religious activity and sits within, whether we like it or not, a theological worldview. So actually, you see, I'm actually trying to draw a different geometry for it. I mean, I guess that some of the debates here, if they were visualized in bubbles, would have a sort of science bubble over here and a theology bubble over here, and some sort of jumping or not between the two, and things being thrown. But you see, I hope you realize I'm drawing a different geometry. I'm drawing a big theology bubble, right? And a science bubble inside it. Right? And that's what I mean by science. In a sense, I'm trying to suggest, don't think of science and religion. Think about, or theology and science. Think of theology of science. Think of a theology of science, and that might open the door a little bit to why we do science in the first place. So it's about that larger level.
There's a question over here, Hilary.
I was just thinking back to the book of Job and reflecting that a lot of the context of it is actually human frailty and transience in the face of God and in the face of the Creator. Yeah. I just wondered what one sense whether perhaps we need to develop an anthropology of humility towards the rest of the world, the non-human natural world.
Oh yes.
And how that would play into what you're saying.
Thank you. That's a beautiful question. And I think I perhaps hinted at an answer when I referred to some of the content of the Lord's answer and how the questioning, searching of reality goes right outside of Job's own domain of experience, right out so to the Leviathan, to the behemoth and these other beasts, extraordinary beasts at the end. Leviathan, I will not fail to speak of his limbs, his strength and graceful form. His breath sets coals ablaze and flames dart from his mouth. What is this? We've been talking about rain and snow, and now we're talking about this extraordinary dragon thing. And he looks down all the haughty, he's king over all the proud, is the final statement of the piece about the Leviathan. Yet it's a very, very decentralizing. And in one sense, the writer is saying to Job, let's change our anthropocentric paradigm. Yeah? Let's decentralize ourselves from creation. You know, yes, you are extraordinarily able to understand, reconstruct, ask questions about creation, but you are not actually at the center of it, Job. So I think that's a beautiful insight, and I think that does help very practically as well, and I think it answers some of Dennis's questions about what it gives equipment to us what we might be allowed to do and what we should do, because creation is not all about us. Because the other thing it resonates with is this old thing of the Genesis, the way that the Genesis stories are divided in our scriptures. And if Nathan Advisa will tell you, if you ever invite him to come, there's the disaster of the chapter divide between Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. I'm sure you just discussed that. Cuts right through the Genesis 1 text. And takes the last bit of the Genesis 1 text and adds it to Genesis 2, which is a disaster because if you stop reading, as the lectioners do at the end of chapter 1, you leave humankind as the pinnacle of creation, which is not what the text does. The text goes on and leaves Shabbat at the center of creation, the rest reconciliation. And so there's actually a lot of de-anthroposis centering going on, but that's beautiful, thank you.
Okay, well, we'll have one last question then, a quick one, and then...
I speak as
yes.
I speak as someone with a long time ago who taught science in secondary schools and colleges and universities, and I really go for your 6 points. They're great. But I think the problem is, and it's the problem when you taught science, is that you're circumscribed by, for example, by time or whatever the case may be. Scientists are circumscribed by the demands of the research they're doing and the people who are paying for the research and so on. So it seems to be very difficult to follow at least one or two of those points successfully in the modern climate.
Yes.
Is that not right?
It is right.
Yeah.
Yes. And I don't think. Yes. Yeah. There are no easy answers here, are there? I don't know that I have much advice for you or for your colleagues that followed after you. But no, I realise that. Other than, there are always those little opportunities. I mean, every so often that opportunity comes along, a little bit of extra time, an option as to what we do in the lab, general study. There's sixth formers doing general studies now, and there's time reserved for that. Well, can we get something along these lines into that window that's opened up in the curriculum? In fact, there's one thing I do something like this, obviously at an appropriate level for schools, for sixth form general studies, and find they're often desperate for material, for people to come and give a different angle on it. So there are a few opportunities, but I agree that within the science curriculum, increasingly fewer.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, I think our time is up, and I think we only ought to thank Tom very much indeed for a very broad and challenging, interesting lecture. So thanks very much.